America and other free and open societies face crucial challenges and opportunities abroad that affect security and prosperity at home. This is a series of conversations with guests who bring deep understanding of today's battlegrounds and creative ideas about how to compete, overcome challenges, capitalize on opportunities, and secure a better future. I am H.R. McMaster. This is Battlegrounds.
On today's episode of Battlegrounds, our focus is on the United Kingdom, a long-standing ally of the United States. Our guest, Lord Mark Sedwill, served as the UK's National Security Advisor from 2017 to 2020 and Cabinet Security Head of the Home Civil Service from 2018 to 2020 under Prime Ministers Theresa May and Boris Johnson. Lord Sedwill previously served as the UK Ambassador to Afghanistan, NATO's senior civilian representative in Afghanistan, Special Representative on Afghanistan and Pakistan, and Permanent Secretary at the Home Office. The Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1922 established the modern United Kingdom, which is both a constitutional monarchy and parliamentary democracy comprising the independent countries of England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Key elements of its rich history and culture include laying the foundation for modern Western education and signing of the Magna Carta in 1215, which established the precedent for rule of law, democratic governance, and individual rights in Western society. Britain's relationship with North America started in 1607 with the arrival of the first permanent English colonists at Jamestown, Virginia. More English colonists arrived to settle what would become the 13 colonies along the eastern seaboard. France and Spain made often competing claims to control large swaths of the resource-rich Americas. Those New World settlements intensified Old World economic and strategic competitions, and in 1756, England declared war on France to start the 7 Years' War. The conflict spanned the globe. Spain joined the fight in the New World, while Prussia waged war against Austria, France, Russia, and Sweden in Europe. Britain prevailed and extended its influence in North American territories previously claimed by France and Spain. But the cost of that war set the stage for the American Revolution. American colonists saw British attempts to raise revenue through taxation as an infringement on their freedom. The War of Independence began in 1775. Over 6 violent years, more American soldiers died as a percentage of the population than in any other of the nation's wars. The Continental Army and their French allies won independence at Yorktown in 1781, and Britain signed the Treaty of Paris to officially end the war 2 years later. But U.S.-British relations remained contentious as the two nations clashed in the War of 1812. During the American Civil War, many of the British elite privately supported and funded the rebellious Confederate States, despite an official proclamation of British neutrality in 1861. Significant tensions persisted in the wake of the Civil War, but the two nations of shared language, culture, and traditions grew close after mutual sacrifice in the bloody world wars of the 20th century. What is now known as the special relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom grew stronger as the nations worked together to create liberal democratic world order in the wake of World War II and overcome the challenge of communist totalitarianism during the nearly 5 decades of Cold War with the Soviet Union. After the mass murder attacks of September 11, 2001, the United Kingdom joined other NATO allies in invoking the Collective Defense Clause of the alliance, joining in the invasion of Afghanistan and the long war that followed to ensure that jihadist terrorists never again enjoyed a safe haven and support base there. British and American forces fought together in Iraq from 2003 to 2011, and continue to sustain counterterrorism efforts in Afghanistan and Syria. The relationship has not been immune to differences, as evidenced by the Suez Crisis of 1956. But the special relationship has proved durable as the country's leaders continue to work closely on security, economic growth, climate change, and human rights. We welcome Lord Sedwill as the UK sustains commitments to security in South Asia and the Middle East, navigates the implications of Britain's exit from the European Union, contends with revisionist powers China and Russia, and begins its recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic.
Lord Mark Sedwill, welcome to Battlegrounds. Hey, let me begin by saying what a pleasure it's been to work with you over the years in Afghanistan for a couple of years, and then quite unexpectedly, we were both national security advisors. Welcome to Battlegrounds, and thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, Charles, great to be with you, and thank you for the opportunity to talk over some of the issues that interest us both.
Mark, the first thing I'd like to talk with you about is Russia. I recall the last few weeks that I had in the White House. We're dealing with the attempted murder of Sergei Skripal and his daughter in Salisbury, and we put together, I think, a really strong response to that under the theory based in your words. I remember at the time you said, "Hey, we have to impose costs on the Kremlin beyond those that they factor in at the beginning of their decisions to conduct this kind of an attack on us." And so I wonder if you'd share your thoughts on the competition with Putin's Russia these days, especially in the wake of the poisoning of Putin's primary rival, Mr. Navalny, and what do you think we should do to cope with Putin's playbook and the way that he's engaged in this sustained campaign of political subversion and what some people have called Russian new generation warfare against us?
Well, thanks, HR. I remember it well, and thank you for being such a great ally in that period. We couldn't have imposed that cost without you being absolutely pivotal in the US administration and ensuring that the Western Alliance stood together in dealing with the Skripal affair. And I think it was a really important example of the world we're now in. That poisoning demonstrated that the old rules that we had all assumed that state-to-state competition would be operated by could no longer be counted upon. I don't quite reach back to the Cold War. Thank you for saying I was a veteran of the Cold War. I'm not that old. But I did start just after it.
Well, you're much younger than me. You're much younger than me, Mark. This is what
I don't think I am. I did start just after it. And of course, that Cold War mentality absolutely affected our worldview, including in the period afterwards. And what the Skripal poisoning did was demonstrate that we could no longer count on the understandings, if you like, the rules that we had applied both during the Cold War and afterwards. And we saw that again with Navalny, the Navalny poisoning subsequently, and then just the misuse of the Russian state machine to now put him in prison. The other thing we've seen with Russia is that more strategically, they have a thing called the continuum doctrine, and they are operating across all of the domains, the traditional domains of land, sea, and air, where they know that they are outmatched. Of course, they have some sophisticated weapons, but in the end, they are badly outmatched in those traditional military domains of land, sea, and air. But they are now operating in three new domains: space, cyberspace, and the information space. And although
the solar winds hack, here in the United States,
exactly,
right,
exactly, and there they've demonstrated. I think this is a striking part of the Putin playbook, that even if you don't have the greatest force overall, and their cyber capabilities are no greater than theirs, their space capabilities certainly aren't, even their information capabilities aren't. But if you are willing to get there firstest with the mostest, as one of your famous Civil War generals said, and apply what capabilities you have ruthlessly and opportunistically, and he's a very skillful user of these.
And unscrupulously.
And unscrupulously, then you can have a real effect. And so I think we've seen that with attempting to undermine our democratic systems, as you say, cyber attacks, both to steal information, but also to position themselves to potentially disrupt. And of course, the development of new weapons in the traditional areas. And if you have a regime that's willing to do that, and also uses non-state actors as proxies, whether criminal groups or others, then that inevitably presents a significant challenge for democratic regimes that believe in the rule of law and apply it to deal with. But of course, what we've got to remember is the oldest lessons of all in the art of war from Sun Tzu: choose the ground on which to fight. So the fact they choose areas on which to attack us does not mean, as we applied over the Skripal affair, that we have to retaliate in kind. We find an area where they're vulnerable and we're strong, and impose cost that way.
So, I think this really applies to this competition in cyberspace in particular, right? That the response is not just only in cyberspace to SolarWinds and to the Russian cyber-enabled information warfare against us. I think we have to integrate all elements of our national power and efforts of like-minded partners to restore a degree of deterrence. And, I remember, Mark, the first thing that you used to stress is we have to attribute it. We have to make sure that there are no doubts about it. I mean, you used to call what Russia does implausible deniability, right? Is that it's clear that Putin is guilty of murder, attempted murder, but he gets away with it. He says, "Oh, that wasn't us. We didn't do that." So, but beyond really, making sure that we can attribute it, we don't provide cover, like I think former President Trump often did, sadly, in terms of his reluctance to call Putin out for his behavior. What more can we do at this stage, right? We've been through a cycle now, Mark, where we thought, we had worked together well in the response to the Skripal poisoning to restore a degree of deterrence. You might recall that around that same time is when U.S. special forces and our partner forces killed, almost 300 Russian mercenaries in Syria, right? It was quite serious at the time, the degree to which Russia was challenging us and was subverting us in any way that they could, not only in cyberspace but physically as well. What more can we do, Mark, to restore deterrence against Putin and to make sure that we prevent the worst case, right, which would be an escalation to a disastrous war?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. One is we need to do as we did in the Skripal case, and that is accept we're operating in an era where uncertainty is high and where implausible denials will be part of the playbook on the other side. And as you'll recall, some of our allies were saying, "Why do you want to go so fast? Why can't you wait till the investigation's in? Well, can you be absolutely sure?" And we just punched through that because we recognized that, as so often in conflict, speed is of the essence. Otherwise, frankly, attention wanders and the initial impact dissipates. And so we had to operate at risk. And what that meant was we had to bring together our intelligence capabilities with our diplomatic and law enforcement campaign. And all of those came together at pace. And traditionally, particularly the intelligence capabilities, don't break out into the open. And we had to declassify material and say, right, no, look, here is the evidence that we can use to demonstrate. We applied investigative techniques we'd been using to deal with terrorist attacks in order to track down and identify the two culprits. And of course, we then had media operations, including Balikat and so on, independent media operations, who actually, unprompted by us, got onto the story and helped identify them and called out the lies that we were being told by the Russians. But I do think, although in that case we were able to take diplomatic action and some law enforcement action, including, for example, dealing with some of the criminal and corrupt funds that flow out of Russia into our financial centers, we have to be ready to respond in kind if there's a more violent attack. And that's why, for example, almost in parallel, the military action we took in Syria after the use of chemical weapons on the battlefield in Syria in order to restore deterrence there wasn't just about that. It was in demonstrating to Russia and other hostile states that the will to use force, the will to protect our values and interests was restored, had been restored in the West, and that they shouldn't count on being able to outmaneuver us by being more aggressive. And so all of these things need to come together. We need to look at every different theatre of competition, let alone of conflict, and remember that they are connected in the minds of our adversaries, even if we tend to see them as separate.
Mark, a point that you made at the beginning is that Russia knows that they can't compete with us on our own terms, right? I mean, their economies the size of Italy's or Texas's economy. And so I think Putin, what he really thinks, his theory of victory is dragging everybody else down, so he's kind of the last man standing. And you see this, this kind of philosophy play out, as you mentioned, in operations really short of war, where he tries to accomplish his objectives below the threshold of what might elicit a concerted response from us. But also he has this really disturbing doctrine now, nuclear doctrine of escalation domination, right? And so, as we confront a really dangerous Russia, we don't want to count them out, right? Because of the problems they've had with COVID or the collapse of oil prices and the stagnant economy. I mean, I think it is a dangerous situation. But Mark, when we were working together on this, our European allies, their response was kind of underwhelming. So what more do you think we need to do within NATO, right? But within the transatlantic alliance and relationship, the U.S. relationship with the EU, what more can we do to cope with Putin's playbook and ensure peace and security? But also convince the Kremlin to stop this destructive activity, whether it's the poisoning of Navalny or what's going on in Belarus or the sustained campaign of cyber-enabled information warfare against us.
Well, I think there's two or three things, HR, and I'll touch on them briefly. First, I think we need to recognise that national security in the modern era is a more complex arena than it was when you and I started out. So national security 1.0 was the defense of the realm, and 2.0 added homeland security and counterterrorism to that. 3.0 includes economic security, environmental security, health security, human security, and so on as well. And we have to remember that our adversaries will try to exploit their advantages and our vulnerabilities across all of those areas in competition, as you say, well below, in some cases, well below the threshold of armed conflict. I think second, in the transatlantic relationship, one of the things we should acknowledge is that it was a significant success for the Trump administration was in getting the Europeans to start to increase their defense expenditure and take seriously the commitment they'd all made back in Wales in 2014 to invest 2% of their national income in defense. And that was essentially just an aspiration, but it took some of the pressure from the president himself to get some of the Europeans to start to take that more seriously. Unfortunately, that came, as you may also remember, almost one of the first things you and I dealt with was the potential weakening of the commitment to Article 5, the commitment to common defence of any NATO ally. I think it was the first bit of turbulence in the relationship that you and I dealt with after you became.
Yeah, someday I'll tell you a few stories about that. But exactly,
well, indeed. But actually, so as a lot. But I think that's the other piece of getting the Europeans to actually do more on defence, is to really make sure that the Russians know that in the end, the insurance policy of Article 5 remains intact, and that commitment, notably to our smallest allies right on the eastern boundary of NATO, the Baltic nations and so on, is absolutely solid. And that's why the enhanced forward presence and so on there as a tripwire is important. I think there's another point, though. This is something the US and the UK have often struggled with somewhat. It's when our European allies talk through the mechanism of the European Union or developing more collective defence capability through that forum. And when we were members of the EU, were always reluctant to see that. We were concerned it would undermine their commitment to NATO and so on. I think actually the bigger risk is lack of capability. I think we can manage the institutional arrangements. And the bigger risk is lack of capability and lack of integrated capability. The 21 EU members who are also members of NATO provide over 90% of the EU's defence capability, but only about even 2/3 of Europe's capability, European NATO's capability, let alone if you include the American commitment, it's a much smaller proportion. And so what we need is for them to actually do more in terms of integrating capability, buy fewer systems, buy the same systems, make sure they're interoperable, properly integrated, so that they are more capable allies. And that is good for us. I think it helps maintain American political commitment to the alliance, to see that the Europeans are stepping up and taking more responsibility for their own security. And it's also an important signal to the Russians, or indeed any adversary who may be operating in our hemisphere, that Europe is serious about defense and security. And as I say, I think the questions of the institutional relationship between NATO and the EU, the institutional relationships between the US, the UK, the EU, and so on, these are things that diplomatic experts can figure out. The key thing is we have enough capability in this continent to provide a significant deterrent to Russian misbehavior. And that's going to have to extend beyond the immediate continent, for example, into the high north, and be capable of being deployed, as we know, elsewhere. Because as you and I know from the experiences we had in Iraq and Afghanistan, if you don't go and sort out trouble somewhere else, it will come to you. And NATO needs to retain that expeditionary capability, even though expeditionary campaigns are somewhat out of fashion.
Well, or as my favorite English philosopher, G.K. Chesterton, once said, war may not be the best way of settling differences, but it may be the only way to make sure that they're not settled for you. And Mark, can you guys talk a little bit more about Europe before? I want to talk with you about Afghanistan, where we first met, and our long relationship with that country and the long struggle there. But on Europe, just quickly, this talk of strategic autonomy, right, in Europe, and to me, it's a bit offensive. It's just I think offensive as maybe Donald Trump was to some of the Europeans, because what it does is it suggests kind of a moral equivalency in the competition with Russia, but especially China. So we're in this competition now with the Chinese Communist Party, which has been even more aggressive since the pandemic that they foisted on the world, right? And Europe is trying to push through this comprehensive agreement on investment. They seem kind of weak, in this competition between us in our free and open societies and China, which is advancing this this mercantilist authoritarian model. Are you concerned about Europe going kind of weak-kneed here in terms of the transatlantic relationship and our need to work together in some of these competitions?
I think it's really important, for the reasons you say, HR, that strategic autonomy, which in the end is a perfectly sensible policy of trying to build up capability, the freedom of action of sovereign nations, and so on. Just as, in a sense, we decided we wanted more strategic autonomy for ourselves through the Brexit process. That is fine, as long as we remember that, and our European partners remember, that there is no moral equivalence between Western nations, democratic systems, and authoritarian regimes, even authoritarian state capitalist regimes, however strong and powerful. And in the end, our alignment of interests with each other within the community of democratic nations, particularly advanced economic democratic nations, far outweighs any of the differences that we may have, and we must stand together. On the point about the strategic question of China, my own view, but I think this is probably the view of the two prime ministers I served, although they would use their own ways of putting it, is that we can't simply revert to an updated version of the Cold War. Cold War 2.0 isn't the right approach to China, not least because economically it's so much bigger and more embedded with our economies, but also because some of the really big challenges facing the planet as a whole, the environmental challenges, climate change, biodiversity, health security, and so on, China has to be involved. They have to be cooperatively involved in tackling some of those challenges. And so we need an approach that balances across the relationship with China our various interests. So there are areas like the environment in which we should cooperate. there are areas that we must contest and confront and contain: their human rights record, their aggressive behavior in the South China Sea, action in Hong Kong, threats to Taiwan, etc. And there are areas we should compete and recognize we're in a strategic competition, whether that's their aim to build influence through the Belt and Road Initiative, or indeed in the economic sphere, ensuring that fair competition is truly fair and that our companies have the same access to their markets and can compete on a level playing field with theirs as they do to ours. And that means a different model to the one that we've allowed to develop over the past 25 years. But it does mean a really strategic approach to China. And the final point I make on that, sorry, before just moving the conversation on, is in particular in this area of the areas where we really must contest, confront, contain. It's critically important that we stand together. We've seen what happens when one ally, Australia, steps out on their own, and they get a pasting from China, but because all they got from the rest of us was a bit of rhetorical solidarity, but nothing substantive. And I think there is a question about whether we need a sort of economic Article 5, if you like, among allies, whereby we say, if any of us is under pressure, then we will all stand together, because in doing so, then we can't, the option of divide and rule to our adversaries or our competitors does not exist. And that restoration of common purpose among the democratic nations is, I hope, one of the priorities for the next few years and of the new US administration.
I think that's such an important point, right? So, I'm talking to you from California, but I think we ought to all start drinking, Australian wine, for example. But we need, I'll tell you, Mark, we really do need to work together on this, because what China will do is they'll employ this strategy of co-option, right? Co-opt you in like they did with Australia, made Australia dependent on the economic relationship with China, and then use that relationship for coercion. So it's co-option, coercion, and then they conceal their most egregious acts as just like, this is just normal business practices. So I think that we can't allow them to take this divide and conquer approach. You're so right about that, and I hope that this is top on the agenda for the U.S. transatlantic agenda, and with the U.S., EU, and UK relationship. You're right. All the words are aligned, and now we just need actions, I think, because what China's doing is they're trying to kill one to scare 100, right? With Australia, So, Mark, we first met in Afghanistan, and I'll tell you, I love the country, I love the people. I wish more Americans, I wish more British citizens knew the people of Afghanistan. I mean, oddly, I think it is it's our longest war, even longer than our War of Independence, Mark, and it's a war that is probably maybe the least understood, right? I mean, it's in this digital age. I think it's the most underreported war maybe in history. And I just saw a letter from the U.S. Secretary of State today to the Afghan government saying, hey, get with the program on this peace agreement with the Taliban. A peace agreement, right, that is essentially based on a fantasy that the Taliban is going to become like more, benevolent maybe, and humane. A peace agreement that's based on an assumption that there's a bold line between the Taliban and the jihadist terrorist groups who want to commit mass murder again on the scale of 9/11, which is the reason why we're in Afghanistan. And so, you were the NATO senior civilian representative when we first met. You were the UK ambassador. Hey, Mark, I look at this war and I think, hey, it's not a 20-year-old war. It's a 1-year war, 20 times over, right? What I would just love for you to maybe explain to our viewers how you see this war and how you view these latest developments, the peace agreement, and then maybe most importantly for our viewers, okay, what can we do, right? What should we endeavor to achieve, and how could we do it at a cost that's acceptable, to British citizens and to U.S. citizens?
Well, I think we could spend the whole of our time together talking about this, because, like you, I retain a sort of passionate connection and great affection for Afghanistan, and it's affected. I've served in many countries around the world, but it's affected me emotionally more than any other place that I've been, and I've always felt a connection to it ever since. I think your point about one war fought 20 times is correct, and one of the reasons for that is that we didn't recognize at the beginning of this that this was going to be a long campaign. Because of the success of the initial effort to expel the Taliban from government after 9/11, chase al-Qaeda out of town and all the rest of it, I think there was a complacency quickly grew up that somehow or other that was the problem solved. And of course, the underlying tensions within Afghanistan itself and within that neighborhood, because Afghanistan is probably the most fought over territory in the world and the most meddled in by its neighbors in the world, that those problems were resolved with the expulsion of the Taliban. And of course, they weren't. They weren't within Afghanistan, and they weren't between Afghanistan and its neighbors. And the neighborhood rivalries that play out in Afghanistan weren't resolved either. And so we had a series of commanders, ambassadors, and so on who came and went, and each felt that they somehow or other were going to be, it was going to be the decisive moment in the campaign.
Yeah.
And how many wars over the past several centuries have we seen that mistake made? Well, it was made again this time.
There are no short-term solutions to long-term problems, right?
Exactly. And if you look within Afghanistan itself, I mean, of course, the Taliban government was an appalling regime responsible for some of the worst brutalities that any of us have seen in our lifetimes. But it's also important to understand what sat behind that. That within the Pashtun community, 40% plus of the Afghan population, it's a multi-ethnic, a very complex multi-ethnic country, of course. I remember, HR, one of the things I used to do when we were in Afghanistan, if I was doing a briefing, was showed a map of the ethnicities, but with the political borders taken off. And then I'd hand somebody one of those laser pointers and say, right, show me the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan and Afghanistan and Iran. Of course,
two-thirds of the Pashtun population is in Pakistan.
Exactly.
Absolutely, yeah.
And as soon as you do that, you understand the real politics. But even within the Pashtuns, there were two tribal federations, the Gilzais and the Duranis. And the tribal federation that essentially came to power after 9/11, led by President Karzai and associated with the royal family and so on, were the Duranis. And the Gilzais, with whom the Taliban had been associated, felt that they had no connection to the government. And so in those parts of Afghanistan...
the Gilzais, we should say for our viewers, are kind of the highland Pashtuns in the eastern part. The Duranis are the lowland Pashtuns, in kind of the southwestern, southeastern part of the country.
So without doing a PhD thesis on the tribes of Afghanistan, the basic point here was that the tribal group from whom the Taliban drew their strength were essentially excluded from power. That created resentment that the Taliban exploited to get themselves back in the game about 3 to 5 years after 9/11. And essentially, we've been dealing with that problem since. So an awful lot of this is not about the ideology of the Taliban. It's about the tribal rivalries within Afghanistan, and some of the
a struggle for power, power,
and some of the actions of the coalition made elements of that worse, because we found ourselves, without meaning to, intervening in those tribal politics, favoring one over another, empowering one warlord against another, and then essentially driving some of the frictions. So actually, one of the lessons of this is to go right the way back to the Powell Doctrine, Colin Powell's doctrine over the First Gulf War, and recognize that if you're going to carry out a military intervention, you need an exit strategy, you need very clear objectives, and you need to recognize it's going to take longer and require more resources than you planned. And he was right about that, and it was right. We should have applied that in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
As for now, there will have to be a political settlement. We can't, of some kind, because the Taliban are too dug into certain parts of Afghan tribal politics and society to be simply completely ignored. And they've shown that they are a factor that can keep the conflict going. But that doesn't, of course, mean handing them the keys to the kingdom, or indeed recognizing them as a legitimate equal of the Afghan government. As we said, they're dug in essentially one part of the Pashtun community of Afghanistan, but there are other communities, the Uzbeks, the Tajiks, etc.
Mark, this is what upsets me the most, right? Is that we have empowered the Taliban in these negotiations with the Afghan government, right? The way this peace agreement was structured, we essentially forced the Afghan government to release 5,000 of the most heinous people on earth. We backed off on any kind of a demand on a ceasefire before the agreement. So the Taliban is committing mass murder attacks and ratcheting up the violence in the midst of these conversations they're having with Afghan government officials. And they're sitting across the table from them saying, "Hey, listen, why are we even talking to you? We just defeated the world's greatest superpower." So I'm sorry, I want our viewers to hear your full perspective on this, but I just wanted to interject that your point is so important. If you're going to leave, right, leave, but don't empower your enemy on the way out.
So I agree with that. That probably the most important thing that the United States and US allies in Afghanistan can do is to demonstrate that we remain committed to Afghanistan for the long term.
Yeah.
If the story is of withdrawal, then the old phrase, "you have the watches, we have the time," will apply, and they'll simply wait us out and then fight this out among Afghans themselves. And who knows how that will end up. Actually, I think we underestimate the resiliency of the Afghan state. I don't think it would be a replay of the early 90s, but clearly the Taliban would be able to cause mayhem for a very long time.
Hey, Mark, I just want to say we underestimate our own resilience as well, I think, because we don't explain the stakes. And I would just point out to our viewers in the United States, who are skeptical about NATO and burden sharing, there are more European troops in Afghanistan right now than there are Americans, right? And so I just feel this is a sustainable, commitment over time if we would be resolved to do it. But Mark, I know people, what people say to me all the time is, okay, how does it end up? Then what is the end state? What can we achieve in Afghanistan? What are your thoughts on that? How would you explain that to the American people? Your fellow British citizens? Okay, hey, this is what we can achieve, and this is why it's worth it.
Well, first, I don't think an enduring commitment requires us to put troops back onto the ground in Afghan villages fighting the way they were when you and I were there. That part of this war is over, and were we to do that, we'd probably create more problems than we would solve. Mm-hmm. What we have to do, though, is stand behind the Afghans, continue to provide them with the capability to upgrade their own forces so they remain strong enough to be able to resist the pressure, and ensure we're underwriting the economic position of the Afghan state. And then we need to use all of our diplomatic authority to essentially get the neighbors to stop playing out their rivalries within Afghanistan itself. That's those are the crucial things I think we can do. The paradox of Afghanistan is that every time we said we wanted to get out and we'd lost patience, we prolonged the war and prolonged our involvement and our commitment. Yeah. If we'd said we were there for the long term, we were there for at least a decade or more back in 2010, 2011, we'd probably be done by now.
Absolutely.
Because they wouldn't have been able to sustain it. But we lost allies from the coalition in 2010, 2011. We had the surge, but we put an end point on it. And so at each stage, we've encouraged the Taliban to believe all they have to do is stay in the fight for a bit longer, and it will go their way. So saying that is not going to happen, we're not going to allow that to happen, and we're going to stay here until Afghanistan is back and settled, is the best way of actually bringing this to a faster conclusion, because it's at that point the Taliban will realize they have to negotiate seriously. They have to be willing to engage in ceasefires, and they have to stop believing that somehow or other they can ride over the whole of the rest of Afghanistan once again. And then the Afghans themselves will work out their own political settlement. That isn't for us to do. They can figure that out. They're strong enough and capable enough to do so. But What we need to do is provide the insurance policy that says we will underwrite this and ensure that a Taliban takeover is not available either now or in the future.
The sad thing is, I think we had that strategy in place in 2017 for the first time, right? So we have this de facto long-term commitment in Afghanistan, but we give away all of the benefits of a long-term commitment by saying, "Hey, we're leaving." We keep saying, "We're leaving, we're leaving, we're leaving." And you mentioned the neighbors in South Asia. Can we talk about Pakistan for a little bit, Marcus? So you were posted in Pakistan, soon after 9/11. And I think it's immensely important that Pakistan play a less destructive role in the region and internationally. I look at our diplomatic engagement toward Pakistan over the years. I think it's characterized by serial gullibility. The Pakistanis say, "Hey, you're going to be the person that convinces us to reduce our support for jihadist terrorist organizations, or to support to reduce our support for the Taliban and so forth." Of course, Pakistan is a nuclear-armed country. It's in a regional rivalry with India in a way that is extremely dangerous. How do you see Pakistan within the broader construct of South Asia, and what can we do to encourage Pakistan to play a least destructive role in the region, and to maybe reduce the chances of what we know would be a devastating war? For example, between Pakistan and India.
Well, that of course is the biggest strategic issue in that region, and I've been through a couple of crises, including when I was in Pakistan, where the prospects of incidents around the line of control, the disputed border, for your viewers, between India and Pakistan up in Kashmir. The line of control instance there threatened to escalate into full-scale war, which could, of course, in the end have gone nuclear. And I remember earlier on, a few years before that, exactly the same problem had happened again after a series of incidents. So that's
and the U.S. and UK worked very closely together there. I remember Deputy Secretary of State Dick Armitage traveled to the region, delivered a ultimatum essentially to the Pakistanis.
Well, we had a series of visits. Secretary Powell, the Foreign Secretary here, Jack Straw, Joschka Fischer, the German Foreign Minister, all went through a period, each of them essentially using their next visit as a means of trying to diffuse some of the tension. And that was a good example of how multilateral diplomatic effort can really help countries walk back from the brink when they can't do so on their own. I think the thing that defines the Pakistani army's worldview, and of course they're dominant in these areas, is the sense of insecurity. One of the odd things about that region is each country is essentially fearful of a more powerful neighbor to their east. So Afghanistan fears Pakistan, Pakistan fears India, India fears China. And of course, they all then look to their west and see the influence of their main adversary there. So Pakistan fears India, sees the hand of India in Afghanistan. India fears China, sees China's influence in Pakistan. And so of course, in the end, resolving all of these tensions in a grand regional bargain would be the best answer, but those things take time. I think with Pakistan in particular, it is in reducing their genuine sense of insecurity, the need for what they would see as asymmetric capabilities in order to offset the threats that they face. But in Afghanistan in particular, I think the thing that we've always failed to convince the Pakistani military of is the risks they're running to the security of Pakistan by allowing essentially this pool of terrorism and extremism to dominate the Pashtun belt, which, as you said, 2/3 of which is in Pakistan itself. And they have their own Taliban problem operating from that area into the rest of Pakistan. And I think they've underestimated the degree to which that threatens the security of the Pakistani state.
Can we talk a little bit more about India? So India is a country that the world needs to succeed, right? I mean, it's important, as you mentioned, the competition with China and China's now, exportation of its authoritarian mercantilist model. We've seen now Chinese, troops bludgeoning Indian soldiers to death on the Himalayan frontier. It's a country that's important to security and stability within South Asia. But if you look even more broadly in the issues of food and water and energy security and climate change, and I mean, any small problem in India is a big problem for the world, just based on scale. What more do you think we should do, Mark, with the U.S., UK, with Europe, to help India succeed, and to not only from a security perspective, but on all these other issues, as you mentioned at the outset, are intertwined with our security these days?
Well, India, for the reasons you say, HR, is important in its own right. Huge country. Within a couple of decades, will actually be the largest country by population in the world. Its population growth rate is exceeding China's and will become the largest country in the world. So it's just critically important in its own right, for security, the future of the global environment, and of course, increasingly for the world economy. It's already one of the top half dozen economies in the world. But it's also important, as you say, because of the example it presents in the international community. Through the Cold War, India was a leading nation in the non-aligned movement. It essentially was developed by Nehru, and there are many countries that look to India, particularly in the developing world, as the natural leader, disinclined to align with one of the superpowers, whether those superpowers are particularly between the United States and the Soviet Union, different, of course, in their relationship with China, and determined to pursue an independent position. So I think we should recognize that India will always have and should always have a leadership role in the world. I think you say, how do we help India succeed? I think it's important to recognize India is a great success. It's the world's largest democracy. They run elections on a scale that are unimaginable to the rest of us, in a country where rates of literacy are low, where rates of poverty are still very high, and they still manage to do it every few years without any disruption throughout the history of independent India. And they have some of the most innovative regions and companies and economic zones in the world. There are many Indian billionaires who are enormously successful, industrious people, and so on. So actually, in many ways, India knows how to succeed because it has the examples of its own success. And much of what India needs to do is to spread the examples of its own success throughout its population. But of course, fundamentally, I think one of the most important policy changes of the Bush administration, Bush 43 administration, was the declaration of India as a major non-NATO ally. That was a really important political gesture and strategic shift. And that needs to be realized in effect, as well as in sort of political and diplomatic language, in terms of cooperation and capability development and so on. And then I think second, it's ensuring that as India develops, India has access to the global markets, to our markets, and there's two-way access of that kind that really embeds the Indian economy in the world economy, and of course in the democratic community within that, of which India is already, as I say, the world's largest and obviously a leading member. So market access, support for the trajectory India is already on, and India is more than capable of realizing the ambitions we all have for that country.
And I think India could be a model of how we get at some of these, international global issues, especially the interconnected problems of climate change and food and water security, right? So I think that the U.S., the EU, the UK, Japan, others should invest in India for all the reasons you mentioned, right? It already is a success. And I think we need India to succeed for the world and to succeed in some geostrategic competitions as well, particularly with China. And so, Mark, I'd like to ask you more about this competition with China. The UK has taken a strong stance, I think, largely because of your efforts, as you served, Prime Ministers May and Johnson. to ban Huawei, to take a stronger stance in connection with China's various forms of economic aggression, and now increasingly physical and cyber aggression. What more can be done to protect ourselves against, I think, what is a very increasingly hostile China that's announcing, hey, listen, we're going to take hostages as a normal element of our foreign policy. With the two Canadians, for example, the two Michaels in China, you have the extension of the party's repressive arm into Hong Kong, and now the threats toward the UK for the UK's support for Hong Kong. There's various new forms of economic warfare that China has been pursuing. What can we do? What do you think is the right approach from a multinational perspective?
I mean, essentially, the simple answer is that authoritarian regimes respect strength. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to drift into conflict. In fact, the best way of avoiding conflict is that great phrase in the chambers in Venice, I think, say, in time of peace, prepare for war. And authoritarian regimes respect strength. And what they have seen is that if they pursue these more aggressive and assertive policies, actually they have been able to do so. And so ensuring that the democratic community in the world, which after all, let's not forget, even the G7, the G7, the two big economic blocs of the US, the EU, and the three big independent advanced economies of Japan, the UK, and Canada, that's still over half the world economy. It's not over half the world population. It is over half the world economy. Add in a few others, like India, Korea, Australia, Malaysia, Indonesia, all democratic nations, all with many shared interests, whatever the difference is between us, and you're very quickly up to 2/3 or more of the world economy. So we mustn't underestimate our strength here, as long as we stand together. And that's the key point, is what are we going to determine is a consistent and coherent policy among the democratic community in our dealings with China. We must not lurch between what one former minister in this country jokingly referred to as Project Kowtow, simply pursuing the economic benefit of integration with China to the exclusion of everything else. But equally, the idea of trying to suppress China's economic progress, to decouple entirely from China, is as unrealistic as that. And therefore, we need the democratic nations to agree a consistent and coherent policy. And as I said, I think that has elements, three elements to it. There are areas where we must stand together and be clear with China that their behavior is unacceptable. If they seek to extend their sovereign control into areas of the South China Sea that are legitimately either international waters or the territory of other nations, we must stand together and prevent that. Some of their human rights record. We don't have to buy goods from areas of China where we've seen these significant human rights violations. We must stand together against the theft of intellectual property and industrial espionage and the hostage taking and so on. And if we do that, and as I said, they respect strength, then they will respond. We mustn't underestimate our strength when we're willing to do so. That does not mean that confrontation has to be the only solution to everything, or that we transmit to the Chinese government the sense that because their political system is different to ours and their political traditions are different to ours, that we are determined upon a hostile relationship with them. This is a choice if there's hostility, it must be a choice they make, not us. And there are areas where we should and must cooperate with them. We have to over the big environmental challenges, otherwise climate change, biodiversity, health security, and these other things. As I said, we must show we're willing to compete in those areas in which China is seeking to extend their influence, areas of Africa and so on, for example, where we've been absent for too long. And it's perfectly legitimate for them to extend their influence. Well, we need to be trying to extend our influence as well. And they will respond to that if what they see is a consistent, coherent strength of purpose among a unified group of democratic nations, with the US in the lead of that. And if that's steady and consistent, I think we can avoid this Thucydides trap issue and find a new equilibrium in the relationship with China. And I called it in a recent news article, détente with Chinese characteristics.
Well, Mark, I'm so glad you're taking this on. I mean, I think it's really important to correct this misunderstanding that, you know, this is a choice between Washington and Beijing, and maybe Europe could pursue strategic autonomy and play us off against one another. Hey, when you look at what China's doing, you know, internally with a genocide in Xinjiang, a slow genocide in Xinjiang, and what they're doing externally, I mean, this is a choice not between Washington and Beijing, but between, I think, sovereignty and servitude. You know, and I think your voice and UK and European voices on this are so darn important these days. You know, Mark, it's a period of time that we're in now where we are emerging from multiple traumas, right? A pandemic, a recession associated with the pandemic. I'm sure you're following what's happening here in the United States with, you know, the social divisions laid bare by George Floyd's murder last year, and the violence and protests that followed that, and then this crazy vitriolic partisan political season we've been through with the presidential election, the assault on the Capitol, and many people, I think, are eager to announce the demise of democracy, right? And this competition that we're in with China, it's really is a competition between an authoritarian model and our democratic model of governance. What's your prognosis on democracy broadly, and what more can we do, right, to strengthen our democratic institutions and processes?
Well, I think we should always be aware of the external threats. We discussed earlier in the conversation the way that Russia, in particular, has been seeking to undermine our democratic systems and so on. But in the end, I think, you know, I'm fundamentally an optimist, and I think the approach that President Reagan took to the end of the Cold War is something from which we could learn. He invested in American success. He didn't simply allow the Cold War to be defined by a competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. He believed that the answer to that competition was for America to succeed, and for the West to succeed, and for the democratic free market model to succeed. And so the first thing we should do in any competition of this kind is reinvest in our own system, have some belief in it and reinvest in it, and not be mesmerized by the competition from elsewhere. And for two reasons. One is it speaks to the human spirit. There aren't too many people in other countries looking for a green card to anywhere but Europe and the United States. And there are good reasons for that. These are the places that people want to make their futures. They want their kids to be educated in, right throughout the world. And that's because there is something in the democratic system, the free market system, that speaks to the human spirit. The other thing we should have some confidence in is if you prioritize control over freedom and control over economic growth, that is probably what you will get. I know we've seen spectacular economic success in China, and it's lifted more people out of poverty as a result in the last 40 years than we've ever seen in human history. Over 90% of the Chinese population were on less than, in constant prices, $2 a day in 1980, and in 2020 that's less than 1%. So it's an extraordinary economic transformation. But I don't think we should fall into the trap of thinking that because they've had some short-term success, an authoritarian system is destined to outpace a democratic system. Our predecessors often thought that about the Soviet Union in the 1950s. Look how that turned out. Actually, the biggest and best thing we can do is invest in our own systems and preserve the things that have made us successful and peaceful examples to the world. And that means doing it together and restoring a sense of purpose among the West. But it does also mean just ensuring that we have some faith in our model.
Well, Mark, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, we certainly have work to do, but we need to be confident, and we should, I think, almost consciously, rebuild some of our confidence and recognize that we have these gifts, right? We do have a say in how we're governed. So, hey, I'd like to ask you one last question. You've been an architect, I think, of British foreign policy for many years, especially the most recent years. And now in a post-Brexit world, how do you see British foreign policy? How do you see the U.S.-British relationship, the special relationship? What do you think are the biggest opportunities, and what's your vision for the United Kingdom's role in the world after Brexit, and how we can work together to advance our mutual interests?
I think for the UK, a global perspective is part of our national interest. I remember, I think, even joking with President Trump once, that for us, global Britain was as much a definition of our national interest as he thought that America First was of the United States national interest. And that's partly because of our different history and perspective and model. The UK is the most open and globalized economy and society in the G20. That's how we've prospered in the past, and I believe that's how we'll prosper in the future post-Brexit. So that optimistic and global perspective must be part of our future, whether one's looking at it through the economic lens or the political and diplomatic lens. In terms of the US and UK, we're the biggest investors in each other's economies. We each employ millions of each other's citizens. London and the City of London and Wall Street are still the biggest financial markets in the world. And of course, we are the biggest defense partners within the North Atlantic Alliance. And the UK, although obviously much, much smaller than the United States, is the United States' most significant military ally. And we, as you and I have done, will continue to serve together around the world as your ally. I think we can continue to play that role that we've played in the past of helping interpret the United States to our European partners and help interpret Europe into the United States. We are, after all, Europeans who speak English, so we have a perspective that reaches into both. Even though we're now outside the EU, of course, we can't have the same influence within the EU we had before, but we can have a great deal of influence as America's primary European ally over the EU. And I think we can be probably a better partner for the United States as we shift our perspective to the Indo-Pacific in other parts of the world that, of course, are not only right at the top of the American agenda. You live and work on the West Coast, and people in Northern Europe often forget that what we regard as East Asia, of course, is to your west. It's across the Pacific, and the West Coast of America has that orientation in a way that is quite different to the perspective that we have here. But we will be present there with you and with our other partners and allies. And that's not just because of nostalgia and relationships we've had there for a long time. Most of the source of growth in the world is currently in the Pacific. It's not all in China. China is an important part of it, but it's in many other countries too. And it's important for the UK's future that we have the best economic connections in that region as well. So I think open, global perspective, big ally, robust ally of the United States, doubling down on our traditional relationships wherever they are, building new ones, and remembering in the end that actually our greatest assets as a nation are the soft power assets of our economic and social model, that people want to be educated here, they want to listen to the BBC, they want to learn English at the British Council, and they aspire to the kind of lives that we've been fortunate enough through an accident of birth to have lived ourselves, and for our kids to enjoy as well. And let's not forget our strengths. Let's not forget those priceless assets that we have as we shape the 21st century, just as we shaped the 20th.
Well, in the midst of the Six Nations tournament as well, I think more Americans should be watching rugby union. Also, Mark.
Well, the Six Nations is an illustration of how the country with the largest population, certainly within the British Isles, and the deepest pockets in that area of sport, will sometimes find themselves on the wrong end of teams that have demonstrated, at least this year, that they work more effectively together on the field. They've been more agile in their tactics, and have pulled together. And so, England had gone down to a couple of defeats, and that's one of the great things about sport. It reminds you that in the end, as in every other area of human endeavor, it isn't played out on paper, it's played out on the field. And the team with fewer resources can sometimes, if they're smarter and more purposeful, prevail.
Absolutely. And, I really look forward to seeing you in our post-pandemic world, maybe for a match at Twickenham. So, hey, Lord Sedwill, on behalf of I look forward to it. So good to see you. Hey, on behalf of the Hoover Institution, I want to thank you for helping us learn more about Battlegrounds, important to building a future of peace and prosperity for generations to come. Thanks for your tremendous service. Thanks for your friendship over the years. And thanks for joining me for this episode of Battlegrounds.
Well, HR, General McMaster, it's been a huge pleasure, and as always, a privilege to be with you. And I look forward to seeing you in person before too long. My very best to you and to the Hoover Institution.
Battlegrounds is a production of the Hoover Institution, where we advance ideas that define a free society. For more information about our work, to hear more of our podcasts, or view our video content, please visit hoover.org.